seems to have remembered she's foreign secretary in the nick of time. Fears of a Russian invasion of Ukraine escalate, and has warned of a terrible quagmire as the result of a Russian-backed conflict. Her contribution to the ongoing war of words between the West and Russia, made on the other side of the planet, is hardly going to get Putin quaking in his boots, especially as America seems to have no answer other than some paltry threats about sanctions. But Vlad has noticed Britain has been stepping defensory to the beleaguered state, while the EU has an unedifying scrap with itself on how to manage the Russian threat, while Germany has been gapped for their gas, exposing the uncomfortable proximity, some might say, of the bloc to the Kremlin and inability to forge any meaningful or coherent foreign policy, despite worryingly trying to usurp NATO's role on the world stage. With Chinese President Xi Jinping watching from the sidelines to assess perhaps how much of a pushover the West is in the light of his own territorial ambitions over Taiwan, the next few months could prove to be a seminal moment in the realignment of the geopolitical axis of power. Well, here's what Foreign Secretary Liz Truss said earlier on today.
The Kremlin haven't learnt the lessons of history. They dream of recreating the Soviet Union or a kind of greater Russia, carving up territory based on ethnicity and language. They claim they want stability while they work to threaten and destabilise others. We know what lies down that path and the terrible toll in lives lost and human suffering it brings. That's why we urge President Putin to desist and step back from Ukraine before he makes a massive strategic mistake.
Well, I'm delighted to be joined by retired Royal Navy Admiral Lord Alan West and Research Fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, Dr. Taras Kuzio. Now, Lord West, let's start with you. Yesterday, I spoke to guests and they said, well, you know, perhaps this is just Putin saber rattling and there isn't really a clear and apparent threat to Ukraine. What's your position? Should we be very nervous right now?
I think we should be extremely worried because I think it's getting more and more likely that something will happen. And I know that Biden referred to incursions as being different from invasion. They're not. They're both invasion, and the Americans then had to make their position clear about it. If you go back some months ago, I'd have thought there was lurking there a possibility of the Russians doing something down at about 5%. I think we're up now at sort of about 50-50 of whether they will do something stupid in Ukraine. So we should be very concerned.
Now I'm going to move on to you, Dr. Kuzio. Do you think that this sort of war of words taking place is enough? I mean, Vladimir Putin's amassed a load of troops along the border. He's not going to sit there and think, oh, well, you know, Liz Truss and Anthony Blinken say don't do it, so I'm not going to, is he? It's not going to make a blind bit of difference.
Well, no, but I think you're very fair on how you caricature the European Union, but I think a bit unfair about Britain. Britain has supplied the largest amount of weapons to Ukraine of any Western country, and Defence Minister Ben Wallace has written recently some incredibly good essays about how he understands why there's this crisis. So I think the British government is pretty much on board. I think that we're not there yet for a full-scale invasion. Ukraine is a very big geographic country. It has the third largest army in Europe, 260,000 people. And that would require something in the region of 3 times more for an invading force. By the end of January, Russia should have about 175, 200,000 troops. That's still not enough for a full-scale invasion. It's enough for smaller scale invasions, of course, in eastern and southern Ukraine, but I don't think we're there yet for a full-scale invasion. Putin is a bully boy. He wants to use this to apply pressure and to get his ultimatums that he's been given to the West to be answered. And that's the reason for this military.
I mean, going on that thing, we're going to come back to you, Lord West. Putin is a bully boy, but he gets away with it, doesn't he? I mean, the precedent was set when he marched into Crimea and said, this is now Russia. And basically, the international community sort of tutted and went, oh, you shouldn't have done that. But there was no material pushback, particularly. So, frankly, it seems as though he can get away with it again. Does it worry you that if he does, whatever scale, if he crosses that border and everyone sort of sits there and goes, well, a few economic sanctions, and he shrugs his shoulders, it does set another dangerous precedent, doesn't it, when it comes to, like I was saying in my introduction, the axis of power geopolitically in the world?
Absolutely. I mean, there's been a backlog of incompetence in handling the situation right back from when the Crimea was invaded, I'm afraid. And there's no doubt that Putin, he's a revisionist. He has stated quite clearly one of the worst days in his life was when the Soviet Union collapsed. He wants to effectively create an old order with spheres of influence. He thinks that the West is rather weak, and I have to say, because we haven't got our act together and focused, we are showing ourselves to be rather weak. It is quite appalling, I think, the way that the European community is not acting as one bloc. Its constituent parts are acting in very different ways, and the behaviour of Germany, I think, is appalling. That flights to Ukraine from us should have to avoid German airspace because they can't be bothered going through all the rigmarole of getting approval to go through there is a dreadful message. The fact that the Germans are so tied to Russia for gas, and indeed as are several other countries in Eastern Europe, the sorts of threats that would worry Putin are as if there was a statement that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline will just not be used at all by Germany if something like this happens. And really, they haven't put their foot down hard. It is the message that's being given to Putin is we're all in disarray and not acting in a concerted fashion. I mean, the Americans, as I say, Biden made this extraordinary comment about invasion or just an incursion, which was an extraordinary comment to make. That has been clarified, but it's not good. NATO really hasn't cohesively really pulled on this. I mean, it has been handled badly for many years, this whole saga, Crimea, the Donbass, and we really need to act in a focused way with all the countries involved, because that is the only way we'll put pressure on Putin. And if we don't do that, you're quite right, he'll do this and then think, oh, maybe I can do something else. The danger there is Ukraine isn't in NATO, but if he tries something like this on the Baltic states, the bottom line is we should then go to war with him because they are NATO members. And no one wants, indeed, I raised this on the floor of the House some weeks ago, and said that I felt the greatest risk to mankind is not actually global warming, but is actually a thermonuclear war. And the government front bench said, yes, we think it would be unfortunate if there's a nuclear war. I find that slightly extraordinary myself. I mean, this is a real risk if things go wrong and NATO starts being attacked by Russia. And you're quite right, if Putin gets away with things, he might try other things.
So yeah, going back to you, Dr. Kuzio, I mean, there have been some noises allegedly coming out of Berlin that they might sort of row back from perhaps appeasing the Kremlin a little bit, especially when it comes to Nord Stream 2. Is that going to be enough? I mean, what does need to happen to make Putin think, oh gosh, maybe I should retreat from some of my aggressions?
Well, there needs to be an upping of the type of sanctions that are in place. I mean, if you compare it to the sanctions against Iran, the sanctions against Russia after 2014 are something in the region of about 3 out of 10. The ones against Iran are about 7 to 8 out of 10. So you need to get up to the Iranian level to be a serious contender in trying to change Putin's policies. I mean, and Nord Stream 2 has to be completely halted. I mean, we used to hear when Donald Trump was US president that it's Trump that's creating divisions between transatlantic countries, between the US and Europe. Well, actually, Germany's promotion of Nord Stream 2 is the biggest divisive factor in Europe. All of its neighbors, including Britain and all the countries around Germany, are opposed to Nord Stream 2. And yet German nationalism has steamrolled this ahead and made itself completely reliant on Putin's gas. So that has to be ended. But the main area is what the British government is doing, and some other countries as well, the United States, Canada, Poland, potentially some others, and that is supplying weaponry to Ukraine. If you want Putin not to go ahead with some kind of invasion, whether it's major or limited, that will be stopped if Putin fears that Ukraine is sufficiently well defended. Ukraine has its own military-industrial complex. It makes its own weaponry. It also buys some weaponry, like Turkish drones, and also gets some Western military assistance. What it currently needs is offensive weaponry, weaponry that can bring down Russian aircraft, because Russia has a preponderance and greater than Ukraine in the air. And that's what the West has been reluctant to provide until now, that kind of weaponry that could potentially offset that Russian advantage. And I think that's where we need to go. The last thing that we want is a hot war in Ukraine. And remember, Ukraine borders 4 NATO members. So it won't just stay in Ukraine. And if there's a war in Ukraine, there'll be in the region of 4 or 5 million refugees trying to get into Europe. So this is a major. One final thing, if I can say.
Okay, but very briefly, we really don't have any time actually. I'm going to have to thank you and end it there, so we're going to be bumped off air. But Lord Alan West, who's a retired Royal Navy Admiral, thank you to you so much for coming on today, and Dr. Taras Kuzio, thank you to you as well, laying it on the line there about, well, quite a